Good morning, and welcome to the 2012 AAMC live webcast, Creating Diverse and Inclusive Cultures, Transforming Ourselves, our Faculty, and our Institutions. This webcast will feature Dr. Scott E. Page, Leonid Hurwicz Collegiate Professor of Complex Systems, Political Science, and Economics at the University of Michigan, and author of The Difference: How the Power of Diversity Creates Better Groups, Firms, Schools, and Societies. I'm Dr. Claire Pomeroy, Vice Chancellor for Human Health Sciences and Dean of the School of Medicine at the University of California, Davis, and a member of the AAMC Board of Directors. Unfortunately, I'm not able to be with you in person, but I wanted to send my greetings and my congratulations. This webcast is spearheaded by two groups, the Group on Faculty Affairs and the Group on Diversity and Inclusion. This GFA and GDI collaboration is a continuation of their recent joint historic conference held last month in Indiana. We thank the leadership of GFA and GDI for fostering an inclusive environment and for welcoming the participation of Council of Academic Societies, Council of Deans, Organization of Resident Representatives, Group on Business Affairs, Group on Educational Affairs, Group on Faculty Practice, Graduate Research, Education, and Training Group, Group on Information Resources, Group on Institutional Advancement, Group on Institutional Planning, Group on Regional Medical Campuses, Group on Research Advancement and Development, Group on Resident Affairs, Group on Student Affairs, and the Group on Women in Medicine and Science. The widespread interest and participation in this webcast reflects the importance of this topic. It is only when we come together to share our diverse life experiences and insights, only when we respect the value that this diversity brings, and only when we embrace the inclusion of all, it is only then that we will find the answers that our society so urgently needs. This webcast is important and timely, as we are entering an era demanding extensive and intensive reform to improve healthcare outcomes for diverse populations, to reduce disparities, to increase value, and to advance our mission of ensuring better health for all. As you know, this summer, the Supreme Court upheld the Affordable Care Act. The AAMC is extremely pleased that the Supreme Court upheld virtually all of the Act. This law is an important step toward an improved healthcare system that gives more Americans access to the care they need when they need it. But it is only the beginning. It is up to us to ensure that the law translates into real societal benefit. America's medical schools and teaching hospitals are committed to improving the nation's healthcare and have been leading the transformation of healthcare delivery through innovations in medical education, clinical care, and research. The court's decision allows the important work of the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation, the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, and the programs supported by the Prevention and Public Health Fund to continue. This webcast provides a platform for creating the energized collaboration that is vital to educate the professionals for tomorrow, for discovery of new knowledge to improve the health of the population, and to craft innovative clinical programs for the years ahead. Some of you may have had the opportunity to participate in the December 2011 AAMC Leadership Forum, where our guest speaker today, Dr. Scott Page, led a fascinating discussion on the value and importance of measuring the impact of diversity for our institutions. We welcome your return participation. And today, Dr. Page and our AAMC leader, Marc Nivet, will work together with you to help make this webcast what I know it will be, a great success. Thank you for participating today. I hope to see you all in November at the AAMC annual meeting in San Francisco, and I thank you for your continued support of the AAMC. Have a great webcast. Good morning.
Good morning. I'm Dr. Marc Nivet, Chief Diversity Officer of the AAMC. It's wonderful to be here in this first ever live webcast of the Group on Faculty Affairs and the Group on Diversity and Inclusion. This is a wonderful opportunity to share with you some insights on diversity and inclusion and their relationship to organizational excellence. I'm here with Dr. Scott Page. You've heard the full introduction of Dr. Scott Page, but Dr. Scott Page has written a wonderful book called The Difference, which I think really exemplifies the work and how we think about diversity at the AAMC and how we think about our work across academic medicine. So Scott, the work that you have put out in this book, The Difference, for us it really helps undergird, it really provides the scientific underpinning to a lot of the theory that we've talked about with diversity and inclusion. Why don't we begin by you just sharing with us a little bit about your work and how you think it connects?
Sure, great. It's great to be here. So I'm a professor actually of something called complex systems, and what we try and do in complex systems is understand complex, complicated worlds. And in those sort of environments, in things like medical profession, business, the economy, people who study ecologies, what we find is the problems are too hard for any one person to solve. They're just too big. There's too many variables. They intersect with too many other things. And no one person's going to really figure them out. And so what you need teams of people. And when you think about then how well that team performs, it comes down to having really two things: individual talent and collective diversity. So what I try and do in my work essentially is this, I think when we think about diversity, typically, if you just say diversity in the context of business, medicine, the academy, people immediately either frame it in sort of political terms, legal terms, or even moral terms. And those dimensions are all there, and they're important to talk about, and there's a lot of really intelligent people working on those sets of issues around the diversity and inclusion question. I'm doing something different. I'm trying to come at this, sort of like, social scientist to scientist and ask, what role does diversity play? What types of diversity do you need? How does it make the collective better? Because we clearly know collectives are better at doing things than individuals in a lot of cases. And we want to ask, what's doing it? What are the appropriate types of diversity? So in particular, in The Difference, two of the things I focus on, because I think they're central to a lot of problems in medicine, the academy, business, policy, are issues related to sort of prediction and forecasting. So how do we know what's going on? How do we diagnose the patient? How do we know whether this policy is going to work to reduce unemployment? And then problem solving. How do we innovate things? How do we come up with new solutions? Now in these two domains, diversity plays very different roles. So it's kind of fun. I don't want to think in whole numbers. I want to think like diversity good. What I want to do is I want to ask, okay, what are the relevant kinds of diversity? What is it that makes a group of people better at forecasting than maybe an individual? There's a lot of evidence of this. There's books like The Wisdom of Crowds. There's the fact, just the empirical fact that businesses have boards of directors. The IMF has a whole group of people. Bernanke has a whole group of people on the Open Market Committee deciding, how do we manage the money supply. So we don't let individuals make forecasts. Typically, we have teams. So what is it? What is it that makes the teams better? And it's really sort of two things. One is that different people categorize the world differently. We have different nouns. So you and I could look at the same patient. We could look at the same, city, and we're just going to frame it different ways because of who we are. And then second, we have different verbs. So we have, in some sense, different causal models of how we think the world works. And those two things mean we're going to make different predictions. What you can show, and what I show in some of my work, other people have shown, there's a lot of people in this space, is that the ability of a group of people to make a forecast depends really in equal measure on how good they are. So I'm not saying you don't want good people, you want the smartest people you can get, but you also want to have diversity. And diversity matters equally. It matters just as much as individual ability when you're combining these forecasts. So in the forecast realm, it's just unequivocal. You want people who see the world in different ways, and you also want people who sort of think about how the world works in different ways. That's just going to make you better. Then the other domain is problem solving. Trying to find better solutions to problems. Think about new ideas, and then you think, okay, how does that work? Where does diversity come into play there? And there it comes in two places as well. One is not so much categorizations of the world, but really just sort of the dimensions you attach to the world. Like, so, what do you think the levers are? So when people talk about thinking outside of the box, that's usually not outside of that person's box. It's just outside of your box. So when the person comes up with something like green ketchup, it's not like that's inconceivable to you. It's just not a variable you thought about tweaking. And so it's these dimensions with which you see the world affect sort of, and how you just sort of arrange things in your head, affect what you're going to move, what levers you're going to pull, what things you're going to try. It's also the case, I think, with problem solving. This is another big difference between problem solving and in prediction, is that it's what tools do you have? What were you trained to do? So when I watch Lost on TV and I watch that doctor do just amazing stuff, I don't have any of those tools, so I can't do any of that stuff. And so you want to think about, okay, what tools are you acquiring? What tools does someone have? And what tools is someone capable of acquiring in order to make improvements? So problem-solving innovation comes down to you got to know how to do it. You got to know how to break the carbon change. You got to know how to suture the wound. You got to know how to take the integral, whatever it is you're trying to do. You got to have those tools, but you also have to have some variation, sort of where you think you can apply them, right? What levers you can pull. So what you see when you think about diversity and its benefit is that it's truly there. So it's not a political statement. It's not a moral statement. It's not a legal statement. It's just sort of a scientific fact. But it's also the case that diversity isn't, in some context, isn't always what you want. So, for example, people say too many cooks spoil the broth. That's true because we've talked about this before. Cooking is irreversible. So once you've decided what you want to do, then you want everybody on the same plan, same page, following through it. So on a specific task, once you've used diversity to figure out your plan, you may not want diversity. But when you're trying to solve hard problems, when you're trying to make forecasts, when you're trying to innovate, it's just something that you need and want. And I think for so long, especially in American society, we've thought in terms of talent. Get the smartest people in the room. And what you want is you want diverse talent. So that's what my work sort of shows.
I think that's wonderful. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that all of you in the audience today have an opportunity to join in this live discussion. So there's a chat icon, so I encourage you to submit questions. I'm going to begin by just posing a few questions that I think will help further illustrate this directly to us and what we do in medical education.
Yeah.
So as you know, medical education, academic medicine is extremely complex, so it fits right into your wheelhouse, so to speak. But we're focusing this tripartite mission of medicine, of patient care rather, of education and research. So what is the sort of application of your work directly to academic medicine?
So in many respects, academic medicine isn't that different from the world I'm in, the academy. So we're trying to do research, we're trying to teach students on the front line, and we're also trying to train graduate students, to teach those students. The difference is the academy is broken up into disciplines so much more. There's English, there's math, there's political science, there's physics, whereas medicine is just so much broader. So I think that there's even more applicability of the sort of stuff that interests me in medicine, and this is the thing I've found over the last couple of years, than there would be, let's say, in business education or in law. And so I think it makes sense actually to break it down and think of each one of them. So let's start with this question of research. I think here's the case is just the clearest. If you look at any journal over the last 20 years and look at number of authors per paper, you'll see that it's gone way up. Now the question is why. It's not that people just like each other a lot more now than they did in the past or something, or we've learned to write in teams. The reality is if you look at number of citations as a function of number of authors, you see that it's increasing. Right? So you just get more citations if you get more authors. It's also the case if you look at what people call home run papers. This is work by Ben Jones and Brian Uzi, or some friends of mine. Academic papers that have more than 100 citations. You see that if it's co-authored, it's 4 times as likely, both in science and sort of hard sciences and the social sciences, to be a home run. So you're just going to get better papers. It's also the case, this is sort of a funny thing, single-authored papers in almost every discipline have a median number of citations of 0. That means nobody writes them, nobody reads it, nobody cites it. That's not true of team-authored papers. And the reason why is because one person can have a bad idea. It's pretty hard for 4 or 5 people to all put in that amount of time and have a bad idea. So at the research end of things, it's just sort of unequivocal. You've got different sets of tools, different ways of representing problems. Diverse teams are just better. On that, let me move all the way to patient care. Let me skip this sort of middle teaching thing. I think here's where it's so interesting. It's interesting for me as a professor as the patient pool is changing, the student pool is changing as well. I mean, demography is telling a very different story in the United States now than it told 20 years ago. When I talk about, in some abstract sense, about different perspectives, when you think about a patient coming in, and I look at I'm not a doctor, I don't even play one on TV, but you think about a patient coming in and you have to interpret, what do I think has caused this particular situation? What do I know about the patient? What do I know about that patient's communities? Those sorts of things. Different people from different backgrounds, different experience levels are just going to interpret that situation in very different ways. And so having diverse understandings of what might have been sort of the causal reason for this patient to be in this situation, I think is going to be really useful. I mean, I'm sure a lot of your audience, I know a lot of my friends read, in the New York Times, they have that that column now where the patient comes in and they talk about all the different people trying to figure it out. And that's just case in point. And there's long traditions within the medical community of getting second opinions and that sort of stuff. Right? That literally just is tapping into diversity at the patient care level. I think at the teaching level, it's a very different story. And I think it's a different story because we've got to now connect two different sets of dots. So on the research end of things, we're basically saying, look, we want a lot of cognitive diversity. We want tool diversity. We want people trained at different hospitals. We want people that have gone off and maybe gotten master's degrees, maybe one in public health, one in nutrition, maybe one in neurobiology, maybe one in information technology. All these different tools that might help us bring medical care, to people more cost effectively and give people better care. At the patient level, I think you're talking more about people having diverse understandings of the patients. So at the teaching level, now, both of these things are meeting. So on the one hand, I think it makes it much more challenging and much more fun because you've got to sit down and think, okay, how do I train these people to, how do I train my residents to basically understand what tools are out there, information technology, what tools are out there in neuroscience, what tools are out there to sort of, that we can help patients, better, have them sort of get better health outcomes. At the same time, you've got to build what, some of my friends call diversity human capital. You've got to think about how do we train these doctors to work with a much more diverse clientele than maybe they have in the past. And if you look at American society, if you look at sort of how segregated we are by race, by income, by ethnicity, even by religion, and there's a recent book out called The Big Sort that shows that we're actually even segregated by political ideology in terms of where we live. People are growing up, in these self-similar environments. And so one of the things you've got to think about is how do you teach them to understand people that they may not know very much about? So, we're sitting here at the University of Michigan. One of the things that Michigan really prides itself on is trying to create this undergraduate experience where you've got people from all parts of, sort of not only American society, but from the world, so that you get that set of experiences. So you get the opportunity to learn from a whole bunch of people. Well, that's going to happen if you're a doctor, whether you like it or not.
That's right.
Right? I mean, when you go through the residency program, you're going to have to deal
That's right.
with all of us.
That's right.
And so I think I think that middle ground, it's really cool, right? So on the one hand, it's like, okay, you've got to not only be aware of all this going on research-wise, you've also got to learn to communicate and understand all these different groups of people.
You make the comment that demography is changing. So
Right.
I firmly believe demography is destiny, and some of the demographers looking at the 2010 census data has really pulled out some interesting information that really shows that the under 18-year-old population is currently just about at parity minority-majority.
Right.
And I think, we've talked about this before, but many of those kids, especially the minority kids, are coming from poor-performing school systems.
Right.
So in terms of, our admissions processes in higher education, it's not limited to medical education.
Right.
How do we harness the talent that's there? What's the role for us in thinking about diversity in this way and really helping us bring that talent along?
This is a question I think every university, every medical school, every law school struggles with. Because on the one hand, you want to think about, who do we let in? You also want to think about we want to find the people that are going to be able to sort of help us collectively do what we want to do best. And I think that there's sort of two steps that have to be made. One is recognizing that you've got to think about talent much more broadly. Mm-hmm. So the first thing is there's been a big movement towards what people call sort of holistic admissions procedures. Right. So 20 years ago in a lot of schools and a lot of programs, they would say, what's your grade point average, what's your MCAT score? Or, in graduate school, what's your grade point average, what's your GRE score? And then you take the highest ranked people, and those are the ones that you get in, and you have some sense that that's talent, and we just want the smartest people. But if you think about, one of the really fun things for me over the last couple of years, I've gotten to meet a lot of people in the medical profession, and you realize the job of a general surgeon and the job of a neurosurgeon and the job of a pediatrician or the job of an obstetrician, very different, require very different skill sets. And so what you want to think about is what are the skills someone needs to succeed at those levels? And then what are the signals, what are the sort of evidentiary phenomena that we might be able to identify that would predict those things? So dealing with stress, a lot of doctors have to deal with stress, and they've also got to be able to multitask well. Well, you can look at someone's resume and you can see, were they involved, things like being involved in athletics, were they involved in clubs, did they debate, were they in situations where they had to be quick on their feet and handle things? And I think you can identify things like that. You can also say you're going to have to deal with this demography problem, right? It's something that's there, and have you had a set of experiences that suggest that you're going to be able to work with this new diverse pool, right? So I think that there's things like that that you can look at. And I know, like, at Michigan, and we had a civil rights initiative passed, a so-called civil rights initiative passed that said we couldn't take race and gender into account. And so we sat there and said, okay, well, what are the predictors of someone being successful? What is it that's going to enable someone to succeed, whether it's in sociology, medical school, the law school? And what we found is these test scores matter for thresholds in a lot of cases, but not much beyond that. So you can imagine someone sitting around, like in the departments I'm in, saying their GRE score is below 700, so they're not going to make it. Or in a medical school saying their MCAT's below 29, no way. But you got to look at the data, and you may find that, in fact, there's no difference between a GRE score of 630 and 700, and there's no difference between an MCAT of 24 and 29. You're just deluding yourself. And you got to think, what is the MCAT testing? What is the GRE testing? And then what do these people have to go do? And they're not taking standardized tests with fill in the blanks, right? They're dealing with people, and they're in high pressure environments, and they've got to be able to do certain things well. And so you can test for things like focus, stress, diligence, energy level. There's all sorts of things that you can find evidence for. And so what we try and do is we have almost like a vector-based approach. Like, here's the set of, have columns of, here's the sort of things that we'd like to see someone show evidence of. Some intellectual spark, some creativity, some entrepreneurial ability. Also, how much did they do with what they had? This is a big thing. Like, we found that people who, if they've had all sorts of resources at their disposal, they've come from, wealthier families, gone to great schools, and they haven't done anything great. Well, there's no reason to think they're going to do anything great if you give them even more resources. But if you got someone who's done pretty well with almost no resources, then you can think, well, maybe they're going to be amazing. So the first part is go holistic, and also think creatively about what that holism might be. So, for example, we've had some extremely successful graduate students at Michigan who've had other careers first, like been police officers, and then realized, I was a police officer because I wanted to reduce crime. But then they realized, but I really want to reduce crime. I don't want to do it at the neighborhood level. Now I've figured this stuff out. And if somebody quits a good job to go because they want to go to grad school, that there's something there, and they might be really well. Second thing I think that may be as important is think in terms of the entire cohort. Now, we've done, when we did our graduate admissions, we found some fairly strong evidence of this, that the whole cohort can rise and fail based on the collection of skills. So, for example, if you don't have anyone who's good with statistics and math in a cohort, that's going to be a problem, because that person can help everyone else out. We found in political science, for example, that if we didn't have anybody who was from the South or anybody who was from sort of an urban area, then when we talk about politics, the discussion really suffered because people didn't have, again, back to the sort of perspectives on things. Sure. What are the set of problems that are out there? People just didn't know how those areas of the world worked. So when you think about who are you bringing in, it's not like you're saying, okay, we want affirmative action, we want one from this column, one from this column, but you want to think about people are not just some sort of number on the MCATs and then a race. Right. I mean, my goodness, you're a pretty complicated guy. If I were going to describe you, it'd take a long time. If you describe you, it'd take a long time. Right. So, appreciate people in their fullness. Yeah. And then when you look at their fullness, say, do we have all this stuff covered? And if you don't have anybody who's shown any inclination to sort of, maybe work with poor people or work with people of color, if you don't have anybody who has any inclination to sort of understand new information technology, right, or no one who's shown any interest in the arts, you just got to ask, what is this whole cohort going to be like? Because these people are going to be like living, eating, breathing together for a long time, and they're going to learn from each other just as much as they learn from you. Sure. And so if you don't think in terms of cohort, I think you're really limiting not only what they're going to learn, but what the entire experience is going to be like, not only for those students, but also for the patients and the doctors as well, because the doctors are going to learn a lot.
Absolutely.
One thing that, as our students have gotten more diverse, I'm learning a lot more than I learned, whether I like it or not.
Sure,
right?
Sure. That's a wonderful pivot point. This is a continued conversation as we discussed from this sort of historic meeting that we've had with the group on faculty affairs and our group on diversity and inclusion. And I'm wondering if there's an analog for faculty hiring from that kind of cohort model.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you can maybe expound on that a little bit. So faculty hiring certainly comes into, it's different, but I wonder if there are things that we can learn from what we're doing in the holistic review process and in the admissions process.
Oh, no, I think it's absolutely true. Like, I know we'll have a tendency, like in the academy, to hire people who all are from the same 2 or 3 universities. And people say, well, this is how we did it at Penn, or this is how we did it at Harvard, and then you do it that way without ever questioning it. And I think bringing people, who are trained in different schools, people who come from different regions of the world, it's just going to give you, faculty hiring works the same way, right? You really want to have people who are going to challenge you in terms of how you think. Because if you look, I love looking at I teach a class on sort of some of this stuff, and there's this thing called the Dartmouth Atlas of medical records, and you see how within each region, like if you're in Iowa, they take your tonsils out, and if you're in Vermont, they don't, right? And so you just get this sense like, wow, there's this, groupthink happens. And so by thinking of the faculty as a cohort as well, you can avoid a lot of that groupthink. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. To pivot a bit, I think there's been, when you came to our meeting back in December, our leadership forum, there was a lot of discussion, a lot of excitement around that visit. And a lot of individuals said, well, what Scott is really talking about is cognitive diversity, different from identity diversity. I'm wondering if you can talk about that, the relationship between the two, if you see a relationship between the two.
Yeah, no, this is a great question. It's one of my favorite questions. So the math I do, and I do, I'm like a geeky math guy, right? The math I do is all about cognitive diversity. At the end of the day, that's how the logic has to work. It can't be because of the color of your skin, or your gender, or your ethnicity itself that you're necessarily going to, get this sort of diversity bonus. It's got to come from the fact that correlates with or causes differences in how you think, because these are cognitive problems. We're talking about solving hard problems, trying to figure out what's going on with the patient. So at the end of the day, the functional value is coming from cognitive diversity. And so when I go out and give talks, whether I'm at Massachusetts General Hospital or here at the University of Michigan, I'm laying out, let's think about cognitive diversity. And this is a difficult thing to do, because if you're a doctor at Mass Gen, or you're a doctor at U of M, you're pretty freaking smart. And you've been told you're pretty freaking smart, from day one. And so I'm trying to come in and say, look, yes, that matters. I'm proud of you for being so smart. But guess what? These problems are too hard even for you. And you need some cognitive diversity. You need people who are smart in different ways. And so that's the first level of thinking. And if I can get people to get that, that's great. Because then they're going to start saying, where do I get that cognitive diversity? So it's easy to think, where do I get talent? I just look for people with high grade point averages and high MCATs. But once you start thinking in terms of, oh, wait, I need cognitive diversity, then think, where do I get it? And then immediately, most people think, well, training matters a lot, because people who went to these different schools were actually trained differently, they learned different techniques, and that's a source. And then they realize experience matters a lot. If you had a different life experience than me, and you've seen different things, especially when you look at things like patient care, that's going to matter a big deal. And then I think then the third step is to recognize, wow, identity matters a lot. And the reason identity matters a lot is two ways. One, indirectly through experience. It's just the case that different identity groups have different experiences. And the second is, I think, the lives we construct. The brain is an incredibly plastic thing. Remember I talked about this sort of big sword stuff. If you look at the books read, television shows watched, music listened to by race and gender in the United States, it's vastly different. And so if you think of you're constructing your brain, I don't have to tell doctors this, right? You think about your brain is something you construct. If you give two brains just completely different sets of experiences, not necessarily by choice, but just because of what you grow up in, they're going to look different. They're going to have, again, remember we talked about those nouns and the verbs. They're going to have different nouns and verbs. So where do different nouns and verbs come from? They fundamentally come from training and experience, but experience is mediated by identity so strongly. And there's a question of, in some cases it's going to matter a lot more than in other cases, right? So I think if we think of how do I look at, how the brain functions, experience and identity are going to matter a little bit there, just in terms of things like, what metaphors do I use, how do I holistically think about things, how do I cope with large multidimensional problems? But it's more abstract. When I look at patient care, I think it's just much more direct. People, we live one very vectored life, and we're going to filter any one patient's experience through sort of our own experiences. And so it's just those of us that have different life experiences are just going to filter those experiences differently, make different predictions, just sort of see the problems in different ways.
Yeah. What I really appreciate about your work is that you help us to think about, it's not diversity for diversity's sake, but it's actually diversity for accelerating the pace to innovation, to change, to better patient care, to translation of research, to better education. Maybe if you can expound a little bit about, so So what ultimately are we really looking for, and how can we accelerate that if it's pace to innovation?
Right.
How do we accelerate that through getting these differences of perspective and the like?
So we should ask easy questions. Right? When I think about what I try and do in situations like this, I'm trying to get people to, again, take this out of the sort of political, legal, moral thing and think about it more like scientists, especially because doctors, are scientists, and think, okay, how do we leverage this? How do we use it? Diversity is really an asset. And so this is, I think, a moment in time, in a way that if we had this conversation 5 years ago, or if we have it 5 years from now, it'd be a different conversation. It's a moment in time because of the Affordable Health Care Act. We're going to have now a whole new demand pool for medical practices. So now you have, in some senses, what I would call the problem of problems, in a sense of what are the problems that are out there. So when you think about the pace of innovation, there's two very different contexts. So one context is we're just sort of going along and we're waiting for someone to think of what a problem is. We're letting somebody just have some genius idea. Hey, I just invented the internet, or here's the car, or here's the water, but we didn't sort of need it. There's another sort of situation. There's a wonderful book that just came out on this called The Idea Factory about Bell Labs, where something's developed or something has changed, and now that brings with it a whole bunch of problems. So people talk about Bell Labs and all this amazing stuff they did, but actually it was fairly easy because of the fact that they knew what the problems were. We got to run a cable under the ocean. We got to give people phone numbers. We got to be able to send messages from one side of the country to the other without it getting sort of lost in just gray goo, right? It's got to somehow not. All this stuff got to work. So once you say we want everybody to have phones, that creates 100 problems. But the nice thing about the 100 problems, you know what they are. And so then you just look for diverse groups of people to go solve those. And that's exactly what they did. Well, here we're in one of those situations, which is awesome. We know what the problem is. We now have to give health care to a whole bunch of people who didn't get health care before. So there's a huge slice, again, one of these demographic slices, that's primarily been helped in emergency rooms. It's been sort of a trauma-based health care for these people. Now they're going to get more direct health care. So the poor in the United States are going to get more direct health care. That brings with it a whole host of problems. So I think where the pace of innovation is going to come from, and this is how I think any management professor would talk about it. They'd say, okay, look, you've got a whole new set of problems. You've got an existing set of organizational and intellectual capacities. There's things you can do. So now you want to say, okay, of those set of problems, which ones do we have something that we can, there's some nails, we can just pound them in. But then there's a bunch of other ones that, okay, maybe you haven't solved. So I think step one is figuring out what do we already know how to do, what don't we? And then the ones you don't know how to do, then I think you've got to sit down and you've got to think about, okay, how are we going to cope with these? What are we going to do? What new types of organizations, what new job descriptions, what new services, how are we going to give medical care or administer medical care to these people at a high value, low cost? And when I say these people, I mean the people who have just not been currently getting health care. And so I think that'll be fun because if you think about it, it should be low-hanging fruit.
That's right.
Because nobody's been working on it. And so I think the opportunities, but there's this real challenge. When I go visit hospitals, there's this tension. On the one hand, there's sort of the Atul Gawande checklist Six Sigma thing. Sure. Let's do what we're doing best. And let's reduce variation. And I think that's true for that first set of problems. But then the second set, you can't reduce variation because you don't know what you're doing. So I think you've got to be much more expansive, much more open. But the thing that I want to keep coming back to when I think about this just purely from a logical standpoint, these problems, the new set of problems are coming from communities of people that have been underserved. And they're also communities of people that are underrepresented within the medical profession. And so one thing, again, we talk about how do you understand the problems? Well, the people from those communities are going to better understand those problems. Right. So the question is then, you need to get those people from those communities in the medical profession. Now, the time delay of taking a kid who's 12 years old right now, from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan or from Detroit and saying, okay, we need you to be a doctor.
Right.
We're talking 18 years. Right. There's a lot of talented people in these communities that are working in the healthcare industries in different capacities. And the question is, we have to figure out ways to tap into their knowledge bases, their understandings of the sets of problems. Because even when I say there exist these problems, a lot of cases we don't even know what they are because we're not from those communities.
That's right.
And so I think that it's low fruit, but we don't know how to solve it unless we really sort of immerse ourselves in those communities, identify the problems, and then figure out, can we solve them or do we need new methods, new techniques?
One of the other benefits of the Affordable Care Act Accountable Care Act is that it also has put some money and some resources into things like comparative effectiveness research. I mean, almost $1 billion put into that. Translational research, it's a big focus for the NIH. What is the role for diversity, inclusion within the researchers? People often say to me, well, researchers are in the lab. It really doesn't matter who they are. They just have to be smart. But I think, we at the AAMC have talked a lot about this, and our scientific officer has talked a tremendous amount about the ability of utilizing and harnessing diversity. And we're working really hard to try to increase the diversity of the biomedical workforce. I'm wondering if you could talk about the connection between who the individual is and what research they're interested in, and the translation of that research back to the community or to the bedside.
Yeah, so there's two. I mean, you've identified the two levels. So one level is what are the problems? And so different people are going to think of different things being problem based on who they are. So different, people from different identity groups may have different sets of values and may think these are the important problems in medicine. And as a result, that's just going to lead research into new directions. So as women entered the academy, for instance, right over the last 50 years, the set of things that we study within the academy has fundamentally changed. And also, by having men and women both looking at the problems, we get very different solutions. I mean, I often joke about this, but when I was in 7th grade, when I saw the video on fertilization of the egg, I was told the story about 10,000 sperm compete for this egg, and only the bravest, strongest, fittest sperm makes it to the egg. Right? That was kind of a male view of the decision of that problem. But when women became out, just actually as a husband-wife team, looked at that same thing and said, actually, it's kind of a dance between, which is sort of what you'd expect. And ironically, that dance is certainly solved by genetic diversity. The egg, you've got an advantage. The sperm has an advantage if it's more diverse. So I think that how you solve the problems is going to differ, just again because of how you frame the world. But then translating it back, I think this is where we get to this diversity human capital thing. If you've created medical school, as medical schools become more diverse, as the students become more diverse, every one of these doctors working in a medical school is going to get experience working with diverse groups of people, namely their residents, and they're going to create close relationships with those residents because that's a pretty intensive interaction. That's going to have all sorts of positive spillovers because the residents are going to be used to working in diverse teams, the doctors are going to work in diverse teams, and then that's just going to spill over into translating that medical practice. So telling someone or helping someone change their life. A lot of the big problems we have in healthcare today deal with behavioral issues, right? It's not curing cancer necessarily. I mean that's still there. And repairing broken legs is still there. But when you think about things like obesity, which is a huge problem, drug use, which is a huge problem, these are things where you've got to help people change their behavior. And if you can't translate, what the research is saying to the patient in a meaningful way, if they think you're just someone telling them what to do who doesn't understand them, that's not going to work. And so, but I think that there's one of the really cool things, I think there's all this positive spillovers. Once part of your life becomes, you become part of a diverse community, I think it's very hard to go back because it's just so much richer, it's so much more interesting, and you realize that, that was fun hanging out with a bunch of people exactly like me, but, this is more fun, especially for people who are smart as doctors, right? Because it's just, more problems, more interesting, more to think about.
There's the worry that, when we have this kind of discussion, we've oversimplified this, right? But this is really hard, but, it sounds like...
I never get accused of that.
So we've been working, our organization and the nation's medical schools and teaching hospitals have been talking about and trying to diversify for the last 40 years. I guess the question is, why do you think it's so hard? And I don't know if you'd buy into this, but I feel like sort of industry overall, the business community overall, has sort of moved ahead in thinking about diversity as a business imperative. And I'm wondering if you can talk to or speak a little about your own assessment as you've been in the academic medicine community lately. What makes it so difficult for us to move forward?
I think it goes both ways. So we have a mutual friend, Daryl Smith, who talks about this, who talks about how changes in technology forced medical schools, universities, businesses to fundamentally change what they do. All sorts of new job descriptions, new buildings, huge capital outlays. It's just had this massive fundamental change. We haven't had the same fundamental change in organizational structure and organizational culture with respect to demographic diversity. It's still the case that maybe we put a few different pictures on the wall, but everything's the exact same way. And so when you think about how welcoming, maybe a residency program is, a medical school is, how approachable it is, I think there's still some really serious barriers there. I think that there has to be a bit of a rethink in terms of, do people who might want to become doctors, who maybe are from groups who traditionally haven't been represented as doctors, do they understand even how to get there?
Right.
I have a number of, Michigan sends a lot of students to undergraduate students to medical school. Some of those kids are second, third generation doctors, and it's incredible how they know how to navigate that incredibly difficult path. Because it's a narrow path that if you fall, we've talked about this before, if you fall off at organic chemistry, you can't climb back up that cliff. And so I think that there's a lot of, in addition to just sort of the performance on these tests, there's a lot of tacit knowledge that someone has to have in order to get there. And there also has to be an understanding of, once I'm there, that's a place I'd really want to be. And so I think that it's going to require, changing of, of the institutions and organizational culture of these places a lot, and even of the path to get there. What do we recognize as, or how do we identify people who potentially could make it, and then how do we give them trajectories that they see as, plausible? And there's recent evidence that, if you go and tell some middle school kid, you can be a doctor, you can be Supreme Court justice, but you don't give them any of the tools or opportunities to get there, that actually has a negative effect. You're better off not telling them that because it's so unrealistic.
Right.
And so I think that it's one thing to say, okay, we're going to now have a holistic review process, but it's a lot harder work to think about, we're going to change our schools, we're going to change how we think about the opportunities we give people in order for people to sort of recognize what they need to do in order to make it, in the medical profession. I think the other thing maybe is also, there may be ways to have people, this has certainly happened within the nursing community, right, with nurse practitioners and physician's assistant sort of positions, that there may be ways to sort of bootstrap up people from these communities that are in existing jobs, and that they're, so maybe the children of registered nurses and the children of nurse practitioners can become doctors because they get the culture. So it's going to take a while.
Yeah.
It's not it's not easy.
It's not easy. Very complex. So what's on the horizon for you and your work? And do you see continuing? I mean, you've been to several of our medical campuses now, and I've gotten great feedback about your visits. But I'm wondering, what do you see as the future for connecting your work to academic medicine and the Accountable Care Act and so forth?
One of the things I'm really trying to think hard about is how do you take these ideas and really leverage them? So how do you think about moving from sort of these mathematical facts to sort of organizational culture, organizational structure, so you get these better outcomes. So bottom line, so what are policies and procedures that you can follow to leverage this stuff better? The other thing that I think a lot about is, can we think about how do we identify young people who might really make a difference and give them the right sort of opportunities? How do we do outreach programs to give people the opportunities so that they can see that they've got an opportunity in this domain? But my own work, I think one of the things that's important, is to sort of, dance with the skills you've got, right? And one of the things that I've really been trying to do is just think through this in a non-ideological way, and just ask, because look, we've talked about this, there's places where two heads are better than one, and there's cases where too many cooks spoil the broth. And I think movements towards diversity are heard if we stand up and say all diversity all the time is better. I was in an organization that self-described itself as very white bread, right? And everybody there was sort of a very narrow slice of the demographic pool, and they realized after talking, wow, we have to change. But then there's a question of, that change in some sense has to be somewhat gradual, but the question is, how fast can you push it? So those are interesting intellectual questions, because there's a lot of evidence if you just suddenly try to go super diverse, the organizational culture can't respond.
Sure.
And this is, the example here that people will give is, some people criticize IBM for giving Apple the mouse. But the reality is, IBM couldn't have dealt with it. Their organizational culture they couldn't have just jumped and started making really hip personal computers. It couldn't have happened, right? They'd have been, I sometimes joke that they'd have been better off making wine or something than making the person, they couldn't do it.
Sure.
And so the thing is that But because of demographic reality, because of, especially within the healthcare profession,
Sure.
it's got to be done. And so I'm saying, in some sense, point B, this sort of diverse, inclusive world is going to be better.
Sure.
Places are at point A. So one of the things that really interests me is, how do you go from A to B?
That's right.
You can't necessarily jump, but you also can't use that as an excuse to go too slowly.
That's
Right?
right.
So change has got to happen, but how do you do it? And there's probably better goat paths and worse goat paths.
Well, this has been a fantastic conversation for me. It's just been, sort of helpful in the work that we do at the AAMC and our member institutions. So, I think we want to continue to have this kind of dialogue. This is just the beginning for us, and our group on Faculty Affairs and Diversity and Inclusion are committed to doing this work. So let's turn it over to the audience out there, and please, I'm going to ask you to continue to send in some questions. We have a few. We're going to spend probably the next 30 minutes or so. I'll pose some direct questions from some of our members. So the first question we have is a question, it's sort of intelligence versus competence as I read it. It's how much of realizing the full benefit of diversity for solving complex issue is dependent upon a different kind of intelligence versus learning a new skill or competency?
So that's a good question. So when you think about, I wish I could ask what exactly is meant by different kind of intelligence. But the thing is, so when you think of it, but let me try and reframe this from I think the question is. So if I put a diverse team together, and now this diverse team comes in and asks, and it works better, one reason for that could be that someone's bringing in a new skill. Like, we didn't know how to do, like, let's suppose we're looking at, incidence of some disease, and someone now has GIS data, and so they're bringing in spatial data, and so we can it's just a new tool. And so now I can learn this new tool, and we can all learn how to read the data in that way, and we're just better at it. So that's one part. There's other parts where the kind of intelligence I think that the question means, what Deborah means here from UMass, is that it's being able to sort of understand what someone's saying. This sort of like what I'm saying is sort of diversity, human capital, really listening to and hearing someone else's opinion and validating someone's presence in the room. So one way that I could make this divide is between sort of the organizational behavior side versus the sort of science side. So there's sort of an art, which is like us being able to listen to one another, me hear what you're saying to be better at what I do. And then there's the pure, just sort of like you've got different tools thing. And those are both in play.
Sure.
One of the things that I talk about a lot and think about a lot with a good friend of mine, John Seeley Brown, is that there are cases where there's like an oracle. So if somebody gives an answer, we know how good it is. We can evaluate it right away.
Right.
And in those cases, you don't need the first kind of stuff. You don't need we don't need to be able to get along, because you just propose something and we plug it in the machine and it's like, oh, you got an 85, mine was an 81, so yours is better. And there are problems that are that way. Some of the more engineering-based problems are that way. And so in situations like that, you don't need this first type of confidence.
Right.
But unfortunately, there aren't as many of those types of situations as you need, and so then you need to build up the art. And the lessons from there, one of them is this validation. People have to feel like their presence is valued, that people are listening, that like I have to feel like, as someone who's more mathematical who goes to diversity and inclusion seminars, if I walk in a room and I feel like people are going, oh God, here's that mathematician, then I'm not going to bring my A game because it's a waste of my time.
Yeah. Got an interesting question here. It's more to the culture piece that you sort of ended with. And the question is, since success is judged by the dominant group in a culture, successful people mimic and emulate those already into the group. How does the tendency to acculturate mediate the influence of diversity?
This is another really good point. So you're right. So there's a question of what's the objective function? And this is the point I was making about, that these changes due to technology, but not these changes due to culture. So when you think about, what's of value, if, you say what's of value is sort of scoring really high on this test, but not what's of value is sort of, being able to get along with and understand that patient pool, you're just going to, get things wrong. So let me give, for instance, sort of within the academy, when we evaluate how good someone is, we'll often say, how many grants did they get? How many papers did they publish? How many students did they train? And we think of these as like really solid objective measures. But we don't ask, most places don't ask on their performance evaluation, who among your colleagues did you rely on for advice the most? Who helped you out the most when you're in situations where you couldn't figure out what to do? Yet within any faculty, there's always people who fill that role, and they're not getting paid for that. They're not getting promoted for that. And so, and that's because that's sort of like just it's a social thing. It's often hard to quantify. There's firms that have changed what they do. So IDEO, which is a design firm, really cutting-edge design firm, they actually don't evaluate people. They evaluate projects. And then your score is just sort of the average of your projects. And the idea being that, like, if you're contributing to the project doing well, then your projects are going to do well. If you're not, your projects aren't going to do well. And so I think that absolutely you can't, this comes down to, you can't just, put a couple new pictures on the wall and have everything be the same. I think you've got to rethink what is your objective and collectively decide what is your objective.
Right.
And especially now, given that medical schools have to serve everyone, right, or obliged to serve everyone as opposed to serving those who have money, I think that the set of problems differs, and the set of criteria for getting solutions to those problems differs. And so that means it's going to require some change, right?
Sure. Yep. Yep.
And it's not just around on racial identity grounds. It's on all sorts of stuff, right?
Yeah. Now, here's an interesting question. It's asking you to sort of comment on the findings of social scientist Robert Putnam, and you know who Robert Putnam is, of course. The degree of diversity of collectives is related negatively to social cohesion. This is a good question for you, because in your book you mentioned that, I'm paraphrasing here, but nothing magical happens when you just throw the diverse group together. You actually have to build a process and build a culture where those differences matter. Maybe you can talk about that. I think that answers this question. Yeah,
a major newspaper was going to do an article on Scott Page, Bob Putnam, and how we disagree. And then they talked to us both, and they said, "Oh darn, they don't disagree." They're saying the same thing. Yeah. But so here's what I'm saying. I'm saying that if you bring people on a problem and you agree on what the objective is, and they bring different tools and understandings, they're going to be better at solving that problem. He's saying if you have people who have come from different identity groups, different value systems, different ages, that sort of thing, it's going to be harder. They're not going to feel as cohesive. Both are true, and they're related. And so, in fact, let me explore the intersection. So a friend of mine, Catherine Phillips, did this great study where she created homogeneous groups and diverse groups and had them work on a problem. She said, who did better? Well, the diverse groups did better, because it was set up. Basically, she tested for cognitive diversity first and put the cognitive diverse groups together, so of course they did better. Then she asked people, how was it for you? And the people in the homogeneous groups thought it was much better, because they were like, yeah, everybody was smart. That was just like me, smart. But when you're in the diverse group, people see dimensions you don't see. They have different verbs, and so it's cognitively harder. And so it's one of those things where if you're learning, you've got to think, and that's challenging, and so it may not be as much fun in a way. And so I think we can't. So what Putnam's saying in his work is that, it feels a little bit less cohesive. It feels more challenging. It's more of a struggle. And what I'm saying, and that's better, right? I mean, you're just going to get. That means that a lot of thinking's going on, a lot of work's going on, and you're going to get better outcomes. Now, there's limits to this, right? If you have and one of the really important things is having cohesion on the goal. If you don't agree on the goal, then you've got all this diversity, and everybody's going in 1,000 different directions. Sure. You're not going to get good outcomes. So one of the things in my book I talk about at length is the problems with diverse preferences. If people want different things, you honestly don't get very good solutions. So there's, it's all of a piece.
Sure.
And you want to be challenged, and that's going to create this cohesion, but you also want to get better outcomes.
Yep. And here's a question that you and I have actually talked a lot about it. It's a long question, so I'll paraphrase it here. So they're really asking, the historical imperative around diversity and inclusion has been one of moral, and you sort of touched upon that. Right. And so the question is, how do we, moving forward, how do we make the pivot without offending people about the moral imperative, without saying we're not talking about the moral imperative, we're talking about the excellence imperative? How do you bridge that gap? I don't know if you've given thought to that.
I think that when I think of the arc of this debate, right, it starts out moral, I think, as well it should. And I think there has to be, if there isn't a genuine acceptance of that, then you're not going to get anywhere. And then it becomes legal. And then it becomes this sort of recognition that talent really doesn't know any color. And then it moves to this idea that, there are differences, that we can't be colorblind. There really are, and we can't be genderblind. There are differences, primarily because the lived experience people have as a function of their identity is just so different. And so those differences are there. And I think that what you've got to do is, it's a two-step process. Remember, because I talked about you don't get the value. This is the stuff that, Robert Thomas at Harvard University and Robin Ely have found. David Thomas, I'm sorry, and Robin Ely found. That if people don't feel validated, if they don't feel as though anyone's taking them seriously, you're not going to get the value. So the first step, in some sense, is the moral argument, is recognizing that each one of us is different. I mean, there's superficial stuff where we look the same, but each one of us is living our own idiosyncratic, unique, hopefully meaningful life. And then, to make, I think, to agree on these moral grounds that, we have to treat everybody with respect. Then once you've got that, then you can tap into these cognitive differences to get better. So it's got to be there at the bedrock. Because otherwise, if you think, no, I shouldn't have any respect for him, but at least maybe he's got a good idea. Well, that's not good. I'm going to feel it.
That's right, yeah. It's a great question in here, and it reminds me that we didn't cover this in the conversation, but there's a lot happening around interprofessional education right now, and our organization is leading in this with other health professional associations. And really, we're starting to come to understand that there is a level of competence that's necessary around the interprofessional education piece. And I often think, and I'd like you to answer it, is sort of, what's the role for diversity and inclusion within this kind of wonderful forward movement we have in interprofessional education?
What do you mean by interprofessional education?
So the ability to sort of teach medical students alongside nursing students and other health profession, physician assistants. They're taking courses together, showing some sort of team competence, very synergistic with what you're talking about. So some of our leading institutions are moving in that direction beyond just having everyone in the lecture hall, but how do we actually, through simulation labs, bring people together and see how they behave and use it as a training tool? It seems very consistent with your work and how you think about bringing the multiplicity of thoughts together.
Right. No, it is. I think that again, this is sort of outside my pay grade, this sort of question. But I think one thing that the one thing I think I can add to this is again going back to this sort of validation thing. If you don't have a set of experiences with these different people who come at life in different ways. So if I'm a neurosurgeon, I had to be pretty driven early on, right? Or if I'm a chief of emergency medicine, I got to be someone who's had a certain set of ambitions, goals, and a purpose I have in life. Well, that the RN may have a very different set of purposes. Maybe what he or she wants to accomplish may be very different. If you don't have an understanding of what people are about and what they want, then you can't lead them. You can't get input from them. You can't do it. So I think if I only hang out with other professors who I didn't go to Ivy League schools, went to Ivy League schools, I'm just seeing a very small slice of the world, and I'm not going to be able to manage people who are different from that. And I'm not going to understand them. I'm going to think, how come you're not staying? How come you're not putting in 18 hours over the weekend? Or how come you're not doing this? So I think that it's crucially important for getting good sort of mental understandings of what other people are about so that you can lead them.
So, there's this, we talked a little bit about the admissions process and the standardized scores. There's another area for us when it comes to residency, and we do this match process. And we end up doing the same thing. We look heavily at the board scores to determine who will get into a residency program. I'm wondering, is in your mind, I don't know how much I think you've thought about this deeply, but I'm wondering, where do you see the opportunities for even a holistic kind of approach to the graduate medical education process?
I was talking about this last night with someone, and it's hard to imagine big slices of corporate America giving standardized tests to see, who's going to get promoted, because they've done, they do these fancy 360 reviews. They've got all this evidence. They've got all this data. When you think about someone who's 18 going to college, there's not that much heterogeneity in terms of what course offerings they've taken, what they've been able to do. So there you've got less to play with. But by the time someone's going to residency, there's a whole lot of information out there about these residents. And so the question is, how do you use that? So I think it's worth looking at the military. The military has to make very similar sorts of decisions, but they keep track of everything. They know how everybody did on every, physical test, mental test, how they were graded by everybody. There's all sorts of evaluation, all sorts of different levels. And they use this to try and figure out who's best. And if you talk to people in the military, you'll rarely hear them say, oh, I felt like I got, shafted on this. I think there's a lot of buy-in to the process. I think you've got to ask how much information you've got, and are you using that information the right way? And it strikes me as it's sort of sloppy and convenient to say, hey, let's give everybody I've just watched you. A whole bunch of people have just watched you for 6 years, and I'm going to give you a 1-hour test or a 6-hour test and assign you based on that when I've got 6 years of information. Now, you don't want to spend that entire 6 years evaluating people and putting together all this stuff that then you have to spend a lot of time figuring out who you're going to get. But there's got to be ways to go deeper.
Sure.
And I think that, especially with new information technology, that can be done in. I think you have to look at corporate America, look at the military, and ask, how are they doing this? How are they promoting? Where are they putting people?
That's right.
And I think they're using much more sophisticated methods. They're not using standardized tests. The other thing, though, like I just saw this interesting study from Microsoft, where they actually look at it. They looked at English schoolboy data, taking an IQ test, and they look at people who've got an IQ. Everybody's got an IQ of like 110, and then they ask, "What's your contextual IQ?" And what that is that like you get more points per question if you got it right and other people got it wrong. And what they show within each IQ is there's massive variation in contextual IQ. Well, that same thing again when you think about this holistic approach and getting the cohorts. Rather if I pick the top 30 people I think I can get based on board scores. Am I really getting holistically the right people? Am I getting an interesting cohort? Probably not. The question is, how do you get that? What are the right dimensions? How do you figure out how to get that information in sort of a relatively efficient way, and then make the right choices? And what's so important about this is people respond to incentives. And this is what I was training about. So if you say it's all about the board scores, what are people going to be doing when they're in med school? Working to make sure they do well on the board scores. If you say it's about constructing this incredible vector of skills and demonstrating capacity. Again, this is another thing IDEO does. They've got all these like things you can get little almost like Girl Scout or Boy Scout badges for. Like I can run a team meeting. Right? If it's about acquiring these diverse, useful skills, then they're going to go, get those. If UCSF says, you got to do these 20 things to make it in a residency program, people are going to get those 20 things, right? So people respond to the measures.
That's right.
And so if you can make the measures things that are going to make doctors better, you're going to get better doctors.
Yep. There's a question here from Ann from Arizona, and I think she's asking for a concrete example or a concrete step, and I think you just started to elucidate some of that. But this is around the faculty. So what are some concrete steps we can take to enhance faculty diversity in terms of your work and the difference? So what can we leverage from what you've written about and what you work on? So how do we facilitate faculty recruitment, development, enhancement?
Okay, so two things. So let's look at development first. So I think one thing that a lot of, really enlightened businesses and government organizations do that I've been really impressed with is they look, again, they take this sort of dimensional view of their, in this case, employees, or in this case, it'd be your medical school faculty, and you ask, what do people know how to do? And then you notice, we don't have anybody in our group, let's suppose this genetics group, who's really, within our sort of genetics group, who knows a lot of statistics. And there's just more and more data out there, so we need this. So then there's two things I think you can do. One is you can say, hey, we think this is a skill that we need to be more diverse collectively to be better at what we do. And there's two options. Option one is, somebody want to learn this? And option two is, let's bring somebody in who knows this. And so, and it could be even true of something like, speaking Spanish could be an example, right? Like we need to speak Spanish. Does somebody want to go learn this? Or do we want to bring someone in? And I think and that's a question you just constantly got to be asking yourself. What are the tools that we think might be necessary, and do we have it? If we don't have it, there's only two ways to get it. And I think people really appreciate that. Like if you come in as like let's say the chief of emergency medicine or chief of OB/GYN, and you say, look, we need someone that can understand big data. Because it's coming in. We need someone in our group. So then you say, hey, anybody want to do this? That typically really raises morale in these organizations because people think, wow, they want me to get better, and there's probably going to be someone who wants to do it. And so I think it's a matter of, if in some abstract way you just say, let's get more diverse, it's not going to work. You got to sit down and think, where do we need it? Right? Where do we need to be more diverse? And then go get it or go learn it. I don't think it's not rocket science.
That's great. Yeah. So it's a great question here that's really talking about the external challenges that we face, the pressures, I guess really against diversity. So how do we meet the external challenges and pressures of rankings of medical schools in an environment where you are trying to advance the diversity of the institution?
Right. Well, one thing is, the simplest way is trying to change how the rankings are done. That always helps, right? Because it is true, right? I think these places feel like we don't want to fall down in the rankings. I think the other thing, though, is if the applicants have an understanding of sort of what's expected, and that's to be more diverse in particular ways, that you don't necessarily sacrifice on those other dimensions, because the students will figure out, okay, I need these test scores, but I also need to do these other things. I mean, undergraduates, I talked to a lot of undergraduates applying to medical school, and again, it gets to this point about they don't know what's needed of them, right? And so I think that better communication to high school students, undergraduates, about what you're looking for and what sort of skills they need and classes they need to take, those sort of things, enable you to not necessarily sacrifice one on the other. The other thing is that, again, we can't think of this in terms of sacrifice, because the thing is, collectively, you're going to do better. And so for graduate school, for us, in the departments I'm in, it's about where do we place people. And so, yeah, we're sort of ranked on how good the GRE scores are coming in, but we're ranked a lot more on who comes out of our program. And so a lot of this is having, not just having faith that the university is going to give you something, but recognizing, hey, it's a lot easier to get diversity than it is to get talent. If everybody else, what we think of as one individual talent on these test scores, it's a lot easier to get really talented people with lots of skills. Right. And our residents will do better. Yeah. And if your residents do better, that's going to, end up giving you a higher ranking.
That's right. Yeah, right. That's right. So there's a question. It's a little different than what we've been talking about, and I think it's meant in a way of kind of, are we missing an opportunity here? So academic medical centers are the biggest employers of underserved communities in major urban areas.
Right.
What strategies could be used to get them to recognize that the community is within their sort of wheelhouse of addressing the medical workforce pipeline and access to care? So meaning they're hiring these individuals who live in these local communities.
Right.
What's the opportunity that we may be missing from either bringing them into the professions, as you alluded to, but also in maybe doing some studies of better health care on those populations?
I think, again, this is outside my expertise, but one thing I do know from thinking about Detroit a lot, right, because we're sort of in the shadow of Detroit here in Ann Arbor, is that there is so much talent. When people think about Detroit, they often think about the people running Detroit, and the sort of political people in Detroit, and then they think about the people who are having, creating problems and having problems, crime problems, drug problems, education problems, those sort of things. What they don't think about is all the incredible rank and file teachers, police officers, firefighters, office. There's a lot of really talented people who understand and know those communities, who aren't necessarily connected to the healthcare system, but yet those. I think you've got to tap into those people, because there are talented people who understand those communities. One more, I want to go back, on the ranking thing again. It's a funny thing. I was at a thing the other day with the CEO of Allstate was there, and he didn't say Allstate's ranked #1 and State Farm is ranked #2. I mean, they're just competing and they're doing different stuff.
Right. And
if you look at an ecology, think of this set of medical schools like an ecology that's got some sort of function. There's no ranking that says, the puma is ranked #1 and the hippo is sitting in 4th place, because they're different animals. They're doing different stuff. Yeah. And so U of M Medical School is doing it's got a different set of problems and a different set of responsibilities than Detroit Medical Center, right? And Wayne State's Medical School. Yeah. They have different challenges. They're as different as a puma and a hippo. Yeah. And the idea of ranking them is ridiculous. Yeah. I mean, it just doesn't. We don't do it. People rank cities, and it's just kind of fun. Yeah. But there was like a recent ranking of college towns, and Ann Arbor was ranked 3rd or something, and we're all like, woo-hoo-hoo. But then College Station, Texas, was ranked #1, right? And we're like, okay, well, maybe because people from the Midwest wouldn't move to College Station, Texas, and people from College Station, Texas, wouldn't move to Ann Arbor. Right. So it's accept the difference, and once you start accepting the difference, the ranking thing becomes silly.
Yeah. No, I agree. I actually think one of the fallacies that we have is that oftentimes we think about medical schools as these monolithic entities, but they all have different missions, which is actually why holistic review works for us. If we can tap into the different missions, just as you've explicated here, I think that gives us the opportunity to maybe think about ourselves in categories, and if you want to benchmark yourself within a category, that might make some sense. But this idea of ranking 1 through 137 doesn't really make sense. So I agree there.
Yeah, no, I was joking with this was somebody's medical school at Michigan, and he asked how I met my wife, and he said, well, she was ranked 23rd among single women in California, and I was ranked 46th, so it was a great match. I just had to take it.
Yeah.
But that's what medical schools do, right?
Yeah.
And that's viewed in that way, it's really silly.
It is.
I mean,
I totally agree.
yeah.
So here's a question that's asking how all of this work translates to the patient. So intuitively, we know that diversity adds value and it's a means to excellence. However, how are we going to demonstrate at the end of the day to patients that they're getting better health care as a result of increased provided diversity?
This, again, as there's movement towards more evidence-based medicine, I think this is one thing that's going to be played out over, we're going to see how it works. And I think one of the challenges with diversity and one of the challenges with complex problems is they're not simple. So when I teach this in my undergraduate class, like if we're hiring people to chop down trees, it's pretty easy to count how many trees you chop down and you can figure out who's got higher ability. So in something that's separable, additive, simple, boy, those metrics just work really well.
Yeah.
Here, you just can't throw diverse people in to deal with a diverse problem and expect it to work. There's going to be some serious learning curves, and hopefully they're going to slope up. But I think in this particular case, and this is something I've learned from talking to doctors a lot over the last couple of years, is that it's not just about the doctor giving the care to the patient. It's about the patient changing, it's about the person often changing their behavioral, their routines, changing how they live. And so a lot of this is going to come down to sort of what's the communication, how's that relationship forming. And so I think we're going to need metrics not only on sort of cost structure, but also metrics on sort of what's the nature of the relationship. So one thing I think is going to have to be thought about very, very carefully is what metrics do you have? Because the reality is, we talked about this a minute ago, people are going to respond to whatever those measures are.
That's right.
And so having a more extensive and expansive set of measures is going to be really important.
Absolutely. Yeah. So here's a question that's directly in your wheelhouse. This is about predictive modeling here. So if things go the way you envision in medical education and healthcare, what types of changes would you predict we would see? Are there models that we can predict what the future would look like if the workforce is more diverse, if the biomedical research is more diverse, if we're educating more on cultural competency? What could we expect to see?
It's always dangerous to. Nate Silver has a new book coming out in 14 days. A guy that does the 538 blog, and sort of what can we predict, and what can't we predict, and things like this are, I think it's almost impossible to predict. I think that you can say that if just because of who is going to be served, that if medical schools and if the medical profession in general becomes more diverse, I think we're going to see major differences in the types of organizational structures that deliver medicine. In particular, the hospital that you drive into with your car that has an expensive room and has all these things is predicated on people who have a substantial amount of resources to pay for it. So I think we're just going to, so one thing that I think people can predict is there'll be different organizational forms. What those will be, I have no idea, right? But there'll be different organizational forms.
Sure. Yeah. So this is a build off a previous question about recruiting diverse faculty. What are some of the concrete steps? Because we sort of agree around this idea of just putting diverse people together, nothing magical happens. How do you go about building those inclusive environments? And what are some of the concrete things you can do at a major institution like a Michigan, for example, to sort of build the environment where you can attract that diverse talent?
I think that, one thing is when you bring someone in who's maybe different than you've had before, and you can identify this person maybe has an interest area that we haven't had before, this person has a tool set that we haven't had before, there have to be resources and opportunities that go along with that. So you can't bring someone in and say, okay, do things the same way, right? You have to say, so I know one company I've worked with, they had very stolid graphics and music, and so they brought in some people to sort of change that, but you have to then say to them, here's some flexibility, here's some opportunity. And I think what's very important is you've got to give them flexibility and opportunity on problems where the success is likely to be high. There's got to be low fruit here. And you want to give people the low fruit. And one of my friends says, in some of these cases, you're digging for fruit. It's so low. Right? So if you put people in these situations where the fruit is low, they're going to succeed. Everybody sees them succeed. So John Rogers, who's famous for beating Michael Jackson in one-on-one, runs Ariel Capital, so he handles Obama and Oprah's money. He runs this group called the Black Board of Directors Association. So he brings in African Americans on board of directors of major corporations. And one of the things he talks about right away is you've got to go in and sort of prove your value add on nuts and bolts sort of stuff to get to have people just sort of respect you. Then your second step is you want to, once you've got some understanding, you want to say, where's the low fruit?
Right.
Go pick it.
Right.
Be handing out the apples.
Yeah.
I mean, so it's really a two-step process. And so I think it's incumbent both upon people coming in on the organization to sit down and figure out, okay, maybe you're different than someone we've had in the past. So maybe we'll have slightly different metrics, or maybe we have slightly different sort of goals for what we want you to do, because we actually want you to collectively make us all better, not just get a good placement. But that puts an additional burden, but on the other hand, it should be less of a burden because the opportunity should be there.
This sort of question reminds me that it's also that we're not limiting this discourse to really the racial and ethnic diversity, but this idea of socioeconomic status.
Oh, it's huge.
And the sort of complexity and multiplicity of identity within, whether it's race, ethnicity, whether it's you're LGBT person, whether you're come from a low socioeconomic background. What are the ways our systems can sort of not just become more inclusive, but actually work intentionally in bringing all of that talent that exists out there, low socioeconomic students of all backgrounds. I mean, have you seen in your work and traveling the country, places that are doing a good job of taking full advantage of those broad dimensions of diversity?
I think that yes, I have. I think what's interesting is also seeing how communities can do this as the culture changes. So let me give sort of 3 examples. So in the last year, I've been to Michigan Tech, right, which is way up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and it's 7-hour drive to get down. So that's a very distinct culture. And then I was at Louisiana Tech, which is in Monroe, Louisiana. It's in Louisiana, down central Louisiana, and then I was at North Dakota State, which is in Fargo. And in each of those places, there's people who they sort of like, in some sense, want to they want to leave those communities to go get really elaborate training, but then they want to come back and serve those communities for the reasons you talked about with Putnam. I mean, they want to be around people who are like them because that's where they grew up and that's where their comfort level is high. I think what's interesting is some of these some organizations, like some professions, are really good at creating these sort of umbrella organizations like the AAMC, where people can then come back and tap into the diverse skills and understandings that other people have in other communities, and then share experiences from their communities, saying, here's the idiosyncratic thing that goes on with the fact that the community that we're serving, and here's how we dealt with it. And so I think that, like one person was saying that they don't have a difficulty with one big issue is family of patients washing their hands. It's a big issue. I was talking to someone, they were saying, from Vermont, they were saying, this isn't an issue with farmers. Because farmers always, they know to wash their hands. People come in the house, wash their hands. So there's just different things in terms of, different local knowledge bases that you can tap into that I think that umbrella organizations can often get that people don't think about. Because we're not saying you have to leave Louisiana and go be in New York and share your diversity there. No, you may want to go back and live in Louisiana. That's great. In fact, we really want that because we want people going back and serving diverse communities. But the thing is, you don't want to then lose them.
That's right.
Right? You don't want to just paddleboard right back down. Right?
That's right. So let me come back just for a second to this faculty diversity piece, because it's a big part of our audience and what they really care about. And in their last meeting, they had a wonderful sort of play. They had a group here from Michigan come out and do a play, sort of act out a search committee. So thinking about, in the room of a search committee, thinking about all of the things that are at play there, when talking about diversity, the people who are advocating for diversity said that they're getting sort of a we know it's important, we got it. So they're asking, can you talk more about how to help the academy move forward with an elevator speech of sorts to be as convincing as possible about about diversity, the need for diversity in the faculty?
Right. So I think this comes down to this sort of thinking of the set of tools people have. And so there's a bias that if I went to a particular school and learned these 10 techniques or these 10 things, that if I see someone who looks like me, I'm going to think they're smart. This is like the, Catherine Phillips stuff, that when I'm in a room of people who look the same as me. So this is the thing with faculty hiring, not only in medical schools, but just across the board. It's so easy to think, this person went to the school I went to, they trained with the people I went to, and so therefore they're smart. Well, if they went to the school you went to and they trained with the people you went to and learned the same stuff as you, they're not bringing anything new. And so someone else who may have, maybe it looks like slightly fewer tools, but who's learned completely, who's learned very different ones, Well, when you think about adding them to the mix, they may actually have more value add. So, the elevator speech, the simple elevator speech I give on this all the time is, when I was at the IMF after the collapse, they talked about if you want to hire one person to manage the World Money Supply, think about, let's hire one person at the World Bank. You're going to hire someone with a Ph.D. from a handful of schools who got these grades, who took these courses, who knows stats, who knows some political economy, who knows economic history. That's what you want. Right. You've already got 600 of those people sitting there. You should be hiring a physicist who knows a lot about the robustness of networks. You should be hiring a sociologist. You should be hiring a social psychologist. Because you want someone there in the mix. Now here, there's certain tasks that you need the person to perform. So there's some baseline things. But you really want to ask, as a collective, for collectively what we want to do, do we want someone, who maybe understands nutrition, or maybe someone who understands, low income, maybe someone who spent 2 years working, teaching, did Teach for America somewhere, and this person knows Camden, New Jersey, or this person knows Newark, New Jersey. That's a skill that's, maybe every bit as valuable as having 20 hours on the MRI machine because you happen to go to University of Michigan, which had all these resources. So I think it's just too easy to think people like me are smart. I mean, people who studied the same as you.
That's right.
And you've really got to think about what tools, what experience is this person bringing, and then once you start thinking that way, I think it's a lot easier to bring in diverse people.
I think that's a perfect place to end this conversation. This has been wonderful.
Yeah,
it's been extremely insightful. It's been educational, and it's been a lot of fun for me as well. Dr. Scott Page is available to come out to your campuses. I think he's been to several of them already, but he's certainly interested in continuing and learning more about medical education and applying what I think is his wonderful way of thinking about diversity and inclusion in a real data-driven and scientific way. It's been really helpful to us as an organization to move forward as well. So, Scott Page, I really thank you so much for your time and energy on this issue. Thank you.
Great.
So before I close, let me just mention a few things. That this, as I started, is just the beginning of a conversation. We will continue this conversation. Scott will not be at our annual meeting, but all of you will be at our annual meeting, November 2nd through the 7th in San Francisco. So I encourage you to come. There are several sessions on this topic, on medical education broadly and its connection to diversity and inclusion, on graduate medical education and its connection to diversity and inclusion. The group on faculty affairs has wonderful sessions set up as well. So we will continue this discourse, and we will continue to elevate our discourse around diversity and inclusion and its impact and its ability to really help us in academic medicine move forward. In addition, I just want to highlight, for those of you who are really interested in doing a deeper dive on these issues, as you may have heard, the AAMC has partnered with Georgetown University to develop a 10-month certificate program on diversity and inclusion. And we are accepting applications until the end of this week for those of you who remain interested. You can go to the AAMC website and find out more about that, sort of aamc.org/diversity, and that will bring you into the window that affords you a lot of opportunity to think about diversity and inclusion. With that, let me just end and say thank you for your time today. Thank you for being part of this, what I think has just been a wonderful conversation and a way to help us continue to elevate the platform of diversity and inclusion in academic medicine. Thank you so much.